When it comes to technology, are you fed up with hype and buzzwords? If you're looking for a tech podcast where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses, reshaping entire industries, and even our world, you've come to the right place. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking to the co-founder of Dimo. And I invited him on the podcast after hearing about how Dimo is building a user-owned IoT platform that allows drivers to collect and share their vehicle data. Ultimately, drivers get insights about their vehicle, contribute data to the open ecosystem where it can be used to build new technology and applications, and earn Dimo tokens for participating. It's an incredibly cool concept, and today I want to try and demystify some of this technology and understand where Dimo is going to take us. So with all that in mind, it's time for me to activate the old school connection that will ensure wherever you're listening in the world, you'll be able to join me and Andy Chatham in conversation, who's currently waiting for us in the East Coast of the US. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. My name is Andy Chatham, and I'm one of the founders of a project called Dimo, and I run a company that's called Digital Infrastructure Inc. that is responsible for building a lot of the software and other technology that goes into the decentralized mobility platform that we're building.
Now, a question I always like to begin with on the podcast is ask my guests, what's your origin story? I mean, can you remember where your passion for tech came from, or even just the moment that put you on the path you're on today?
Well, I'm not an engineer, but I grew up in a very nerd-friendly household. I'd say my dad is a very original nerd and worked at a company called BBN that was, primarily responsible for building a lot of the pieces of the internet back in the 70s and 80s and spent his whole career in the tech space. So I kind of grew up around technology and had a computer from a very young age. And so certainly that was probably where the seed came from in my case. And as far as the mobility and transportation world, I think it probably went back to, I was in college and I kind of happened into this job running a moving company and got really into building teams of people and systems that are responsible for, at that time, it was just logistics, but ultimately my career was primarily focused on passenger transportation and like mobility more broadly. And so I've spent about 10 years building different mobility technologies. I started my career at a company that spun out from Zappos.com in Las Vegas, and they were responsible for building one of the first subscription shared vehicle services in the US. So we worked with Tesla and a bunch of other early EV manufacturers to build a lot of electric vehicle infrastructure, one of their superchargers, a big fleet charging hub. We worked with a company called Jump Bikes that was, or eventually they became Jump Bikes, but they were building shared bike systems, dockless shared bike systems. And we combined it all into a very innovative business model and got to see sort of like where the future of transportation was going. And that, kind of led me down the path of, what eventually got me to Dimo and spent about 7 years at a company called Transdev before that, and was primarily focused on helping autonomous vehicle companies scale up their operations and take their technology from being a science project and help them turn it into a piece of mobility infrastructure. And so, yeah, that's my personal career. We have a bunch of other people on the team who have deep backgrounds in automotive technology, primarily focused on connected vehicles. And then a lot of people from the crypto and Web3 space that are interested in kind of infusing a lot of the not just theory, but also technology behind things like Bitcoin and Ethereum into building an open mobility platform, which we think has a lot of appealing properties to it, and is something that is kind of core to what we're building at Dimo.
And I'm so glad you shared that story with us today, because just listening to it, I can see how that path led you to Dimo. And what's the story behind the company? Can you tell me a bit more about that and how ultimately you're helping drivers get more from their car using technology?
So the story has a couple of different threads to it that we ended up weaving together. And I left my job at Transdev right at the beginning of the pandemic, and was lucky to be able to have them as a consulting client. And we were working on building a very big project with Waymo, the Google self-driving car company. And so it was good to be able to kind of, see the very bleeding edge of what people were doing with connected and automated vehicles, and also I felt like there was some problems that had not been solved yet, or that were very on the cusp of being solved. And so the original focus of the company was building infrastructure to support automated parking operations, and we were focused specifically on airports and downtown business districts for large cities. And so we were working with real estate developers and parking lot operators who owned a lot of parking spaces. And when the pandemic hit, the parking business took an absolute nosedive. Like it just was, gone within weeks. Nobody was flying, nobody was driving to work anymore. And so we really had to go back to the drawing board. But the original insight that we were trying to, sort of pull on was that autonomous vehicles were really 100% ready for some very limited set of use cases that we felt like were still quite valuable. And that includes parking. And one of the pieces that was missing was a system that could essentially help coordinate between multiple different types of vehicles and allow them to achieve some goal within a shared space. So you want to be able to park Teslas and Waymo vehicles and GM vehicles and Ford vehicles in the same lot, but have them essentially coordinate with each other and achieve some outcome. And there's a lot that comes up when you try to do that, and it's a whole different architecture for how these systems should fit together. And so it, there's a bunch of sort of hop steps and leaps from there, but essentially the hardware device that we ended up producing for the first version of Dimo is kind of like a black box on the airplane, and it allows you to record and save down all the data from the vehicle, and also make it available to developers that might want to create some sort of application on top of it. And so, automated parking is probably not going to happen for a few more years with what we're building today, but we think that was kind of like the genesis point and what caused us to sort of start going down the rabbit hole. And then on the other side of the company, we really started getting hands-on with projects like Helium. They're building a decentralized wireless network, and we were actually one of the early miners of Helium, and we set up some networks and realized that they had done something quite significant in terms of sort of flipping the business model of building a wireless network on its head and allowing individuals to contribute to something that previously they were just consumers of, right? So when you buy a cell phone plan, you're consuming the cell phone network. You have no idea how it works or where it is around you. You can't improve it if you want to. And we felt like that was quite a meaningful innovation, if not just from a technological standpoint, but also from a social standpoint. And it really aligned with how we thought the mobility network really does work today. It's already quite decentralized. There's millions of different, agencies and automakers and stakeholders in this, thing that kind of combines into, being the mobility experience that people have on a day-to-day basis. And so seeing that and kind of combining it with a lot of our insights into where the automotive world is going was really what led us to what Dimo is today, which is a way for people to start to collect and monetize data from their vehicles, and also for app developers to create new experiences with this open and shared platform for vehicle data.
And this space is moving so quickly at the moment. And from the time I've spent in the US, I've seen people hail, I think it was a Lyft, where you can hail an autonomous vehicle along the Vegas Strip. And I've seen in Phoenix, for example, in Arizona, they've got the Waymo testing there. So there's so much happening. But I'm curious, how do you see this landscape evolving and ultimately reshaping mobility to bring people into this Web3 world that we keep hearing about?
So there's a lot of, I touched on this before, but the technology needs to line up with the infrastructure a lot more in order for it to scale. So what we have today are things that can work in fleets of hundreds of vehicles in a specific city. But in order for it to impact everybody's life on a day-to-day basis and make its way into consumer vehicles and be something that is really moving the needle from a societal standpoint, there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done to adapt it and plug it into existing mobility infrastructure. And that's the roads, that's parking spaces, but there's also, the laws and law enforcement and regulations and insurance. And a lot of what's required to do that is really this sort of shared data layer where you have things like, one simple example that people like to use with cars is, what's the equivalent of the DMV for an autonomous vehicle? Do you have to give it a driving test? Do you have to give it a driving test every time you update the software on the vehicle? Like, how does that actually plug in and scale up over time? And we think it's a much bigger challenge than something that just one company can take on their own. And it's also something where you don't want a single company doing all of those things, right? So the solution up to this point in the autonomous vehicle space has been get $10 billion and try to solve this massive problem basically by yourself and put it into one product that people can use. And in the future, I think it's going to look like many more companies solving specific problems, but also coordinated by this sort of shared data layer that controls things like, the identity of the vehicle, their licensing status, allows them to maybe pay for things or access the world in a way that is much more aligned with how humans do today. So that's going to take, another 5 to 10 years to fully build out. And companies that adopt a more open and interoperable approach, I think, are going to be at the cutting edge of kind of pushing that forward and able to realize the benefits of having shared infrastructure, which has always been very important for mobility.
And I would imagine the long winding roads of Arizona are completely different to rush hour in LA or New York, for example. So what does the future of mobility for transit dense cities look like to you? And can you possibly offer the listeners a vision of what we can expect to come? And as you said, probably 5 to 10 years away, but how do you see it evolving?
So for transit dense cities, the future is probably going to look very similar to what it does today. And I think the cities that have huge reliance on personal car ownership and lots of existing roads and very little transit, like we have in the US for the most part, with a few exceptions, are going to be the ones that are more radically transformed. But it all comes down, it's one of the things that I think you realize after spending enough time in the mobility space, working with transit agencies or DOTs, departments of transportation, is it's all a geometry problem. And it's very simple math that dictates like why traffic jams happen or why taking the train is faster than driving in your personal car to get to a specific destination or not. And so those fundamental laws of physics are not going to change. And the ways that people get from A to B might change. And I think one of the most important things is how people price scarce resources like right of way on the road. And you're starting to see some really interesting pilots with congestion pricing have, they've taken enough time now where you have some real data on whether it impacts traffic, how you can sort of pull those levers in different ways to price things like traffic and lead to better outcomes for everybody as a whole. And automation and electrification are really just going to add more tools to the toolkit, but ultimately it's up to policymakers in a specific city to decide, here's how much traffic we have and how much we're willing to live with. And once you can price things like that, it's fairly simple to maybe not solve these problems because there are always trade-offs, but at least to experiment and come up with some better outcomes.
And just to bring your vision to life here and help listeners understand how we get there, can you expand on how to build apps and services in this space that will actually compete on their merits, not an access to gated distribution channels?
Yeah. So step one in our master plan, which you can read all about on our website or go to our documentation and dig into if you really want to nerd out, is connecting all the cars, right? So right now we have we're about 7 months into having a publicly available product that anybody can use. And we've already connected over 400 different makes and models of vehicles to the same platform, which is quite unique in terms of the connected vehicle world. So step one for us is like get all of the cars, as many of the cars as we possibly can connected. There's thousands of people that have connected their cars to this point and many more that are waiting to do so with availability of hardware, which is something that we've been working on as well. And so we're really building up this pretty massive and very interesting data set that allows you to very quickly gain confidence as a developer. Like I can make this work in a 2017 Nissan Versa, and I can make it work in a 2021 Tesla Model Y. And the app is going to run the same way. I can trust the data is coming from the right source. And that's a big thing that we've spent, multiple years of time at this point perfecting. And then, there's a couple of categories of apps that we know need to exist on top of the platform. And so we're pretty aggressively supporting teams that are building those things. And so one category is, how do I sell my car for the most money when I want to go sell it? And that's something that we think is a huge benefit to users. You can save them thousands of dollars if you give them access to better resources and information. And you can get them better prices if they're willing to share more data about how their vehicle's been driven and where it is and how many miles it has. And so those are some of the like very simple experiences that you can create with the data that we already have today and improve over time. And there's some really big categories for that. So, vehicle, like the used car market is 3 times bigger than the new car market. And It's multiple trillions of dollars just in the US alone. We're live in the US, Canada, and Europe. So people will be able to create those experiences for each individual market and allow people to opt in and share their data and get better prices when they're going to buy or sell. And insurance is the same way. Maintenance is the same way. So there's all these huge existing categories that we're supporting and looking to build more of these experiences on top of. And our goal is to make it as cheap as possible for developers to create those experiences without having to go and convince thousands of people to connect their car to something or produce a new hardware device. And really they can focus on just creating the best app experience for users.
And another topic I know is close to your heart after doing a bit of research on you and the company, and that is improving the real world by building a foundation for open cyber physical systems. Great line, but can you expand on that and what excites you about that?
So I think there's a potential future in which people trust connected, just the IoT world, like anything connected to the internet, much less. And that's a bad thing. And we miss out on potentially massive benefits as a society because of that. And so our goal is really, when you get down to the core of it, is trying to make the data that's coming from these devices more accessible, allow people to actually take ownership of it, like give them identities that can be, controlled by their owners, not just the companies that made them. And like philosophically, that's something that very much applies to cars, and people have already been fighting this battle for years when it comes to like right to repair for cars. And IoT and like connecting these things to the internet really just opens up like a whole bunch of other questions that we take a very simple approach on, which is if you bought it, it's yours, and you should be able to access it and modify it or use the data from it however you want, for the most part, like within the bounds of the law, essentially. And so, connected cars are just the biggest category of IoT devices. And we think it's very important that people trust them and feel like they're in complete ownership of them, because otherwise things like automation and electrification are going to take a lot longer to happen. And ultimately, we just don't want to wind up in a world that looks very similar to the world that we're in today with, Facebook or Instagram kind of like controlling all the data and, and monetizing our attention. We don't want to wind up in that world when it comes to connected cars. And so that's why we're pushing very hard on this approach that we have today. And ultimately, we think that the world has changed substantially since the sort of like Web 2.0 social networking type of bargain that we made 10, 15 years ago. And so we're very confident that we're going to be able to build technology that helps move things in the right direction.
And I'm curious, what are the biggest challenges of reinventing digital infrastructure for moving objects and of course, that growing decentralized IoT networks that we're seeing?
The biggest challenge is creating a consumer experience on top of these networks that is better than what's available, via your Ford app or your Tesla app or your Toyota app. And so in some cases today, like we've found experiences that we can create that are leveraging the strengths of something that's very open and decentralized, right? Like when you go to Toyota and you say, hey, how much is my car worth? You know that they're giving you the answer that Toyota wants to give you, not the answer that's best for you as the user. So like that's an experience that I think we're going to be able to create. Like even if you go to Carvana and you ask them, or CarMax or whoever, whatever used car marketplace, like we think we can create a genuinely differentiated experience because we have lots of data about your car that people who want to buy your car value and will give you more money for it. And we can help you sort through those offers and say, here's the best one. And you can do the same for insurance, and you can do the same for things that people are already spending lots of money on. And so like the biggest challenge, I think, up to this point with other projects in the space has been like, how do you show tangible consumer adoption based on like dollars spent in these networks? And I think we're on the cusp of, some pretty big unlocks happening there. And, it's always slower to take the open and transparent approach. And there's so many things that you can do with this information once it's out there that it's worth like taking the time to do it right. And, ultimately there'll be some really compelling stuff that comes out of that.
And what about yourselves? What's your grand vision for Dimo? And apologies for the pun, but what excites you about the road ahead?
The grand vision is, there's about, so the company that I started with three other partners, Yev, our CTO, and Rob, who's kind of in charge of the Web3 implementation side of things, and Alex, who's our COO, who is growing the e-commerce presence and a lot of the partnerships and app developers on the platform. Like we all started with this vision of we want to build this relatively small company that seeds this ecosystem of hundreds or dozens or hundreds of other companies building in on top of Dimo, and that's something that we're really seeing some great progress towards today. We have multiple other for-profit companies that are building hardware, building apps, building things that are going to start to roll out over the next 6 months or so on top of the platform. And so, just from like a tactical standpoint, that's how we're approaching building Demo. And the long-term vision as far as what we hope to deliver are really compelling consumer experiences that help solve significant problems for people, like issues around transacting with your vehicle or maintaining it over time, like really getting into and starting to make meaningful progress on solving some of those problems for people. And then a big thing that's not immediately obvious right now is building out the hardware ecosystem and creating more ways for people to connect to Demo. And there's going to be some pretty exciting announcements on that. We're very bullish on the category of aftermarket electronics for cars. We think that there's a lot of stuff in that world that's going to start to really push the envelope and create some exciting new capabilities for people as it relates to adding more intelligence and connectivity to their vehicle, and also, allowing that to be something that they control as a user, not something that's like mediated by the OEM of the car. And so we're looking to a future where there's 20 people working on the core Digital Infrastructure Inc. team today, but there's probably 50 people or so today that are waking up every day and like thinking about how to make Demo better because they work at a hardware company or they work at a separate software company, and like growing that number quite a bit over the next year is a real goal of ours. And then of course, adding users and helping them transact on the platform is going to be what allows us to do that faster.
Well, we started the podcast today talking about your origin story, the fantastic journey you've been on. And as we come full circle, I'm going to ask you, can you share the funniest or most interesting story that has happened in your career? Is there anything that springs to mind there?
Certainly the most, and I think our CTO, Yev, would probably agree with me on this, is certainly the most interesting things that I've seen in my career came out of the autonomous vehicle space just before we started Demo together. And we saw a bunch of stuff in that world that we can't, we were under serious NDAs, and it's a very, privacy enshrouded world. But we certainly saw things happen with a lot of these really massive budget, R&D, like science projects that were playing out on public roads that led us to believe like there's no way that this is going to work like this at scale. And there needs to be a whole new, architecture for how these things interact with the real world. And a lot of that was driven by very specific experiences, whether it was some kind of accident or, a software update that broke a bunch of robots out on public roads, or like, things that like you see in that world. And, it's obviously not specific to any specific project. Like all of them have these issues. And it was really transformative because it was only available to such a small number of people. Like, there's maybe a couple thousand people working in that world, but this is a technology that we were thinking like very clearly is going to impact hundreds of millions of people in the next 5 to 10 years. And so seeing like these issues develop in some of these early deployments, and then realizing that there's this really big gap that needs to be filled that's nobody's really focusing on today. I think that's probably the most interesting thing that's happened in my career. Certainly why I'm doing what I am doing today, although it's not very specific because I'm sworn to secrecy.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. But before I let you go, can you just remind everyone listening of where they can find out more information about Demo, explore anything we talked about a little deeper, and even contact your team if they've got any questions?
We have a couple different ways to do that. You can go to Dimo_network on Twitter. So DIMO_network. And that's the easiest way to figure out what's going on with the project on a day-to-day basis. We also have a pretty active Discord server with a few thousand people in there hacking on cars, testing new software builds, that sort of stuff if you really want to go deep. And that's chat.demo.zone. And then our website is demo.zone, ZONE. And you can figure out everything you need to about the project there. And if you'd like to get in touch, Discord is generally the best way to do that.
Awesome. I can sense a lot of people heading to your Discord channel as we speak. And love chatting with you today. You covered so much in a small amount of time, and you did hint that there's a few big announcements to come. You're leaving us with a big teaser, so it sounds like I'm going to have to get you on later in the year. But more than anything, just thank you for sharing your story today, Andy.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Neil. And happy to come back anytime. And we'll be pushing out a bunch of stuff over the next couple of weeks. So depending on when this drops, you might see a whole new Dimo website or some new ways to purchase hardware up on the internet somewhere.
Roads, where we're going, we don't need roads. Wow, what a cool topic. And one of the many reasons why I'll be following the progress of Dimo very closely. And I will be getting them back on the podcast as soon as they set off my tech spidey sensors again. But I love today just chatting about the future of mobility for transit-dense cities, reinventing digital infrastructure for moving objects, and also exploring the importance of growing decentralized IoT networks and how, if we dare to look even further in the future, how blockchain and IoT technologies will power innovation in the auto industry. But as I always say on this podcast, you've heard from me and you've heard from today's guests. It's so important that I hear your voice too. I know you have unique experiences and insights, and I want you to be part of this conversation. And there are many ways that you can contact me. Simply email me at techblogwriter@outlook.com. If you would like to slide into my DMs and send me an audio message on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok, you can find me at Neil C. Hughes. But a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.